it's important to understand sufficiently about the passage, Act 17, in order to speak, appropriately about it, and then to try to apply that to our everyday situation as Christian academics, wherever we are, in whatever role we are. So, here we are, with one of the most famous passages in the Bible, and I suppose we have about 10, 12, 15 minutes to try to unpack some of that before trying to apply it. Let me say, first of all, it is a very popular passage. I'm sure you have come across it many, many times. In any book on apologetics that is worth, its price, should have this as something in it. But why is that? That's an important thing. Why do people refer to this as a very important passage? However, it's often misunderstood. And there are at least 3 or 4 ways that this passage is misunderstood. First of all, it is misunderstood sometimes as a formal legal defense. Well, we know from many other places in the book of Acts that it is, Paul did address courts or officials in different contexts, and especially the last chapters of Acts has a series of such appearances. This, however, is a different context from a formal court context. And you may have noticed the name Areopagus Council, which was the council at that time. Previously, they had a lot more authority, but at Paul's time, one of the tasks they had was to assess and possibly license heralds of foreign gods. Okay, that makes a lot of sense in this passage. Paul is actually appearing to some people as a herald of foreign gods. So the Areopagus Council has this role. By the way, Areopagus, Ares, is the Greek word for the god of war, equivalent to the Latin Mars. Sometimes this is called, Paul's speech on Mars Hill. I'm afraid, however, that is not, according to most researchers, completely correct, because the Areopagus Council they had its name from the little hill called the Ares Hill. But usually, at this time, the Areopagus Council, most scholars say, met in the agora, in the marketplace. If that is true, then the whole scene is set in the marketplace. We can imagine Paul walking around, engaging people in dialogue, and also preaching. Arguing and preaching. Interesting. Proclamation and argument goes hand in hand. And it's very interesting to see that because he already had communicated something about the Christian faith, the gospel, the speech itself, which we read here, is not, which is another common misunderstanding, it's not a missionary primer, really. It's not the first time people hear something. Probably. We are working on probabilities here, okay? Because Paul had already addressed a number of questions, and he had focused on Jesus and the resurrection. But why on earth would they get the impression that Paul was an advocate of foreign gods? Well, the most natural explanation is that Jesus was a masculine name, coupled with Anastasia, a feminine name, meaning resurrection. So they thought, aha, here is this Jewish rabbi coming into this context. This strange rabbi, he doesn't seem like other Jewish rabbis, by the way. And he's coming, and he's talking about Jesus and Anastasia. That has to be a divine couple. Aha, teaching has to be assessed by this, this qualifying council. And by the way, maybe we might even get some money out of this. There might be a need of a new altar. Aha, more money to the city, more money, more business going on, So that's one aspect. And then, so it's not a formal formal legal defense. It's not a missionary primer as such, the speech. Thirdly, it's not a mistake. It's not that Paul here is someone who surrenders to the philosophies of Athens. And that 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 then describes that he had to repent from this sinful behavior, you know? No, it's not at all. And there are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is that when you analyze Paul's speech, it's very much shaped by the Old Testament prophetic approach to idolatry. On the other hand, it's also in a tradition where you can find from the Old Testament prophets going through the Jewish Hellenistic apologists before the Christians, you know, the first century before, and then going through Paul and the others, and then, you know, continuing with the second century apologists like Justin Martyr and others. So that's a very interesting historical line. But more importantly, when you think of the as New Testament material, this fits Paul's intention with the 2-volume work, Luke Acts. Because why on earth did Paul write this? Well, you remember the preface in Luke 1? So that you, dear Theophilus, could know how credible this was. And what is being argued for as credible? Well, the story is historically credible. The message is theologically, as a worldview, it's credible. And the faith step they have taken, which was a risky step, I don't know if you have seen the new Paul movie. Have you seen that, some of you? Shows the persecution, just a few years after this. Very tough persecution. And it was risky becoming Christian. So Paul, or Luke rather, he wrote in order to assure them their life's choice, most important choice, had been the right choice. It was a legitimate, credible faith to believe in Jesus Christ. John Stott always has had a way of formulating, cracking things into a nice way. And his popular commentary on Acts is absolutely excellent. And he talks about that what we see here is what Paul saw, many, many idols. What Paul felt, he was greatly distressed. And the word used there is the same as the Old Testament about the jealousy of the Lord when challenged by idolatry. Very, very strong language. What Paul saw, what Paul felt, what Paul did. He went into the marketplace. He went around, in the colonnades, engaging people, proclaiming and arguing. What Paul saw, what Paul felt, what Paul did, and what Paul said. That is then both the initial communication and then the follow-up speech. So the right way of understanding, Paul's speech here is as a follow-up speech, where he engages with their questions. He engages with their objections. He engages with the worldview alternatives, with an indirect aim, because he was facing both a critical and a curious audience. And Socrates and others had actually advised in such a rhetorical context how to do that. Well, then you should choose an indirect approach. So that's how he's doing it. So that's the setting, okay? The setting is, we have covered basically the preface to the speech. Let's look at the speech itself. How is Paul then arguing in this speech? What we see, first of all, Paul identifies points of contact. Later on in the speech, that is definitely the poets, of course. But the most important point of contact is probably the altar to an unknown God. And that altar, we need to say something about that. What you could write first, let's do all the 5 points then. Points of contact. Second point is natural theology. Third point is ultimate authority. Fourth point is Jesus and the resurrection. And then finally, we have points of tension. You see, it's a very interesting observation. If you read 5 commentaries or 10 commentaries or 20 commentaries or 100 commentaries on this passage, or people who apply this passage into apologetics, evangelism, cultural engagement, some of them focus only on the points of contact, only on the bridge building aspect. Paul identifying with, affirming, Others focus only on points of tension, how Paul challenges. And it is my conviction that we need to have both. Otherwise, we are losing out on the passage. I think that's probably one of my most important takeaway messages from this session is, don't interpret Act 17 in an unbalanced way. Because we have to look at it from the biblical holistic context. And Paul starts, as I said, with the points of contact. The most important one, as I mentioned, was the altar to an unknown God. And that altar has at least 3 dimensions, and it's important for the rest of the argument. This is an analysis of Paul's argumentative approach. It's not immediately obvious when you look at the text. This is sort of analyzing the exegetical material and coming up with an argument outline. The altar to an unknown God, at least 3 functions. 1, it's an acknowledgement of their longing and their admission of ignorance. That is something positive. They have a basic, this altar to an unknown God that Paul talks about, there is something true there, something to be stewards of, some recognition of a fundamental aspect. As human beings, if we are honest, God is unknown to us to a very large extent. So Paul is saying they actually understand reality at this level in a way. But wait a minute, Paul was greatly distressed. So here you find, even though Paul was greatly distressed, he's actually engaging with them. So he has processed his spiritual reaction and is trying to be wise. Probably been praying for wisdom, when moving into this context. The next level of the altar is that if this one altar has some truth in it, or maybe a lot of truth in it, what about all the other altars? Because they are claiming knowledge about the gods, whereas this altar is claiming ignorance. That's a conflict, isn't it? So by pointing to this altar, Paul is not only acknowledging something true there, he's also saying all the other altars are wrong. And Paul is connecting to Socrates, and Socrates' critique of idolatry very strongly. But there is a third element there. And I think we should imagine that at least some of those listening would have known about a legend of why was this altar there in the first place? Well, it's probably something happened some 100 years before where there was something hitting the city, maybe a plague, and they thought the gods are behind this. This is the divine wrath. The wrath of the gods is hitting us hard. How do we react to that? We need to make offerings to the gods. But why? How is this going to be solved? And some people came up with a thought. It might be that we don't know which God is behind this. Maybe we haven't covered all our bets. Maybe there is 1 or 2 or 3 gods that we don't know that's behind this. Let's make sure. Let's have a safety precaution and erect a new altar, an altar to an unknown God. So the concept of judgment is there very clearly in the altar. And as you know, Paul returns to that concept. So the concept of judgment would have been there in those who knew the story. Okay, points of contact. And of course, we could apply this immediately and talk about how important it is for us to think along those lines. To acknowledge all there is of truth. Then Paul moves on and says, what is identified there as something unknown by you, I'm going to tell you about that. I'm going to share that with you, argue with you about why that is true. And then we find the longest argument in the speech is about natural theology. It's about the fact that all people have their notions, their understandings, their way of reading the ultimate questions, answering the ultimate questions. And when we look at the world around us, we look at ourselves, we try to make sense of that. There is a sense-making process. And Paul is then taking on the different worldviews. And we find especially the two key philosophical schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans, and then probably the council people, and probably the polytheists, And N.T. Wright, a very famous New Testament theologian and previously bishop, Anglican bishop, he says, this is like Paul acting as a master chess player. Do you know when a master chess player comes to a place and he travels around, he often gather people who are fairly good at the local or regional level to play, and there's different tables set out, and this master chess player goes to one draw and another draw. I think this is a very good illustration of Paul. One draw with the Stoics, one draw with the Epicureans, one draw with the polytheistic, one draw with maybe some others in the Athenian Areopagus Council. So, because the Stoics had some sense of a divine immanence at some level. Their concept of logos, for example, was close to that. They also, whereas the Epicureans had some sense of a divine transcendence. The gods were far away. So what Paul is communicating is God is both immanent and transcendent. And that explains. The other things are half-truths at best. Whereas the Judeo-Christian worldview is a full truth, a complete worldview. We all know the concept, especially in the intellectual world, about intellectual copyright. And if you have written a research paper or something, you are the author of that. You want to be respected for that. This is, in some way, basically the argument. If God is the author of the universe, and of humanity, he has authority over everything. Then Paul comes back to, well, is God still unknown then? No, he's not unknown. He has made himself known. And this is a very brief part of the speech. And of course, we must imagine that this is a very condensed summary, of a sustained argument. But still, it's there. And there, by a man. Okay, emphasizing the humanity of Jesus, which relates to their misunderstanding of the divine couple, by the way. And then Paul moves into challenging them. And we find, as with all speeches in Acts almost, that there is a diverse reaction. Some and others, some were positive, some others were negative. And there is even some people coming to faith. Okay, this is the basic argumentative outline. And of course, there's a lot to say on each point, but let's sort of leave this for a moment and then ask ourselves, how does this apply to our everyday academic context? Well, I think it applies in many ways. The context, there's a line, of course, in terms of intellectual history, there is a very natural line from ancient Athens through with their philosophical schools and the academy there and so on to the modern academy. That's one line, of course, which makes this an interesting case study. Then I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, what are we thinking about in terms of our contemporary tasks? Because being involved in an academic context, over time especially, involves a number of things. If we put aside for the moment in being involved in strategic leadership and management roles in a university context, being a faculty involves at least 3 tasks. One is education, teaching, education, supervision, engaging with students, degrees and all that. The other thing is research, of course, research and development. And the third, and we should make note of, I think, that the university is the only place, the university sector, higher education sector, is the only place where this is required as a foundation for everything. The research. Your own research or being aware of others' research. And then thirdly, there is a task that is often neglected by people, but it's increasingly becoming recognized, what is called as the third mission of higher education institutions. That's communication with the wider world. It might be the region where the university or university college is. It might be the professional arena they are serving. It might be, in terms of Christian institutions, might be those who are owners or supporters, and the churches, the wider scene. So I think it's my conviction that we haven't properly explored that third dimension in our institutional context. And of course, thinking about Paul, we could think about how Paul was a communicator. And that would relate to all 3 tasks, wouldn't it? We could also relate to how Paul opened up for a perspective, He was allowed a voice into the arena. And that's how the academy works, isn't it? That we are allowed to speak into a pluralistic context of competing perspectives. However, in the Christian institutional context, we have chosen to build an institution where, in principle, people align with that when they sign up as faculty, and maybe also as students. That depends on where we are and the policies, of course. And we could think about the way Paul engaged through all this with the questions, the objections, and the worldviews. And we could think about Paul's indirect aim, facing both a critical and a curious audience, and how to relate to that. Well, following, as I said, the advice of Socrates and others, he chose an indirect way of approaching the task. If we think in terms of questions, objections, and worldview alternatives, I think maybe it's in a few minutes' time, I would like you to try to focus on what do you think are the major questions we encounter in our academic context against the Christian faith, or more of a curiosity, more of a how are people being curious about the Christian faith? What are the major objections that people are facing us with? And what are the major worldviews that people are shaped by in the academy? So, because when we talk about apologetics, one way of defining apologetics is to say that apologetics is actually arguing for the truth and the relevance of the Christian faith over against questions, objections, and worldview alternatives. But before doing that, let me just emphasize that there is, I brought you mentioned the Lausanne commitment, Dahle, and, well, you mentioned Lausanne movement, and the most recent little publication is called, the most significant, the third in history after Lausanne Covenant, the Manila Manifesto, is the Cape Town Commitment. And there is actually a section also on research and higher education there. And I just would like to read for you what is said there, to highlight. It's under the headline, Truth and the Public Arenas. The interlocking arenas of government, business, and academia have a strong influence on the values of each nation, and in human terms, define the freedom of the church. We encourage Christ followers to be actively involved in these spheres, both in public service or private enterprise, in order to shape societal values and influence public debate. We encourage support for Christ-centered schools and universities that are committed to academic excellence and biblical truth. And then a bit further down, we encourage young Christian academics to consider a long-term career in the secular university, to teach and develop their discipline from a biblical worldview, thereby to influence their subject field. We dare not neglect the academy. And the word we dare not neglect, or the expression we dare not neglect the academy, is actually from Charles Malik, who was one of the key persons behind the UN Declaration of Human Rights, a fine Christian Lebanese statesman. And he talked about the two tasks of the Christian scholar: redeeming the soul and redeeming the mind. Very fine. This is an important publication on that from the US on the recent years. So I think I would like to leave it there with a very sketchy introduction, I'm afraid, but still the time doesn't allow for more if we are going to have some meaningful conversation. And one of my invitations into this conversation together would be to ask you what would be the major questions that you encounter about the Christian faith that is more positive, the curiosity bit. What would be the major objections, that's the criticism, and what are the worldviews, what are the systems of thought that we have to engage with? And then how can we learn from Paul and for what he did here before the Areopagus Council in all these areas?